what's the strategy? What is it that companies really should be doing to be able to accomplish both? How do you make that happen?
So before joining Michigan State's faculty, I was in the United States Air Force for 20 years as a logistics planner, was the job that I was in. And the military, as you might expect, is good for developing plans for a full range of things that might happen. And I always found it a little bit humorous that whenever something came up, we never had we never had a plan that we could just reach up to the shelf and pull that one off and it fit. Mm-hmm. What we did have was we had a whole lot of options. And so that planning function is really very valuable, because then you end up, going over to the shelf and going, it's not this, and it's not this. But it's a little bit of each of these three. And so you pull chapter 1 out of this plan and you pull chapter 2 out of that plan. And so the value of planning, I think, gets to that uncertainty component, because if you have done the plan for a variety of different things that might happen, you now have that flexibility to say, this isn't really exactly meeting our needs, but we can go and we can add these other components out of that. So what are the things that companies can be doing? It's comes down to an investment mindset. We invest all the time in our systems, in our facilities, in our intellectual property, hopefully in our people. But we don't often think about investing in supply chain resilience. And it's something that can be invested in. Industries that are heavy CapEx and continuous flow processes, think about steel plants, chemical plants, petroleum facilities, they invest very heavily in buffers of raw materials, so that fuel production facility doesn't get shut down, because shutting down one of those facilities and turning it back on is a very expensive venture. Steel plants, same thing. When you go visit these plants, they talk about how they've been running for decades and decades. I mean, at very low rates at sometimes, but you just don't turn them off because the off and on costs are very high. And so those buffers are of raw materials, of physical space, of manpower, and also of finished goods, so that they can build that up over time and then work on the efficiency in the plant to then feed those customers. If you're in an industry that is much lighter on its feet, let's say, if you look at the fashion clothing industry, I mean, what we know about next year's colors is that they'll be in a certain general color palette, but will it be this blue or a slightly different blue is a little uncertain. And the fashion clothing industry is very, very good at, rather than building up massive buffers of possible assortments of clothing that might be desirable of the consumer, they are very quick in responding to the demand signal as they hear about it. And so investing in those ways, in the agility and in the buffers is one of the biggest things. Information, investing in information. Do you have good relationships with your suppliers so that you know ahead of a missed shipment that maybe they're falling a little bit behind, maybe their liquidity is being challenged, and you may need to help them with that. On the other side, information coming back from who you sell to on what they're seeing in the way of demand. The security of your supply chain, investing in that. If you're in one of these big, heavy CapEx industries that I talked about earlier, you're going to want a buffer between you and the environment, people in the environment, as well as the actual physical environment. And so if you go to these kinds of places, you notice there's a fence, and then there's bollards, and then there's a whole bunch of space, because then nothing bad can get close to it. The river can't get close to it. You generally don't stick them on the coast. You have lots of physical security in that way. And then the preparedness that I talked about planning wise. And so investing in that information, in those buffers, in security and preparedness, it's hard though. Sometimes the buffers are easy to run the numbers on. We can look at that, and particularly they work for risk events rather than uncertainty events. But having the presence of mind to say, our supply chain, or this portion of our supply chain, is more in the uncertainty space that's going to knock us off the rails, then some of those other types of investments are probably where they need to be thinking about putting their money in. And it's tough on the balance sheet to do that sometimes. But if you look at some who came through this pandemic better than others and walk that back, I think what we're going to see is that they had made those investments in information and relationships and flexibility and things that allowed them to pivot when the market, went sideways, if you will.
Yeah, I like this concept of investment mindset because it seems like the type of thing that we would need to be able to convince senior leadership outside the supply chain function that these types of investments, these types of capabilities that may need to be developed are critical and maybe help us sell it. Is that pivotal to what you think needs to happen, or is there
Yeah,
something
I think
else?
particularly on the flexibility, agility side of things. I mean, the real nice part about that is they tend to be useful in a lot of situations. So rather than developing a agility and flexibility to deal with a pandemic, well, it's probably also good for dealing with a demand spike or a supply constriction or any number of other things. That flexible workforce, that flexible bill of materials. You don't have to wait for this singular event to happen. It's probably going to help you on a day-to-day basis to be more flexible, more agile, and adaptable. And so yes, you would hopefully, once investing in those types of those abilities that we talked about, you'd be able to deploy those in more minor ways, not quite what we've seen this year in 2020 with the pandemic, but on other smaller disruptions and risk events of unexpected types.
Yeah. That's really great, Stan, because it sounds to me like what supply chain professionals really need to do is be strategic, be integrative, and be financially focused. If you're going to have the ability to sell these types of ideas to senior leadership and make a huge value impact on the business.